Let's think for a moment about the past history of Android and Java. So first off, with Java, it was first introduced to the developer public back in 1995. And given where we are today, it's widely considered to be very mature, very reliable. There's a lot of code out there written for Java. And then let's think about Android for a minute. It's predominantly based on Java, so that gives it a background, where the code sequences, all the source code availability back to that 1995 release is available. And because it's based on Java, it's going to allow us, to make extensive use of a lot of these existing libraries. So how can we go about leveraging some of this Java infrastructure in Mono for Android, .NET, C#? And there's a couple of ways to do this. So first off, there's the Java Native Interface, JNI. And, that's been available since the initial shipment of Mono for Android. However, it's typically been, fairly difficult to work with. There's not a lot of IntelliSense there. And so, developers tend to not use that. Then, with the introduction of Mono for Android 4.2, there's a Java binding library project, and that is a wrapper. It's going to allow us as developers to take a Java library, a jar file, and we can import that library into our application, and then we can use that library. Okay, so it's going to allow us from .NET, C# to interface into a Java library fairly easily, call methods, get properties, those kinds of things, and then we can get our results back. So that capability is there for us. It allows us to integrate with this massive library of source code that's out there. So just to mention a few things about the Java binding library. So just to mention a few more things about that Java bindings library. It is new in Mono for Android 4.2. So it's a new project template that you can use. You'll see it when you go to select a new project inside of Mono for Android. It's available, it's there. And basically what it's going to do, it's going to allow us to automate those bindings. So we don't have to go and manually code up a lot of JNI. We can go and basically the Java binding library will go out, it will interrogate a jar file, it'll say, hey, here's what this jar file exposes, and then it will basically provide us a C# interface into that jar file. The general workflow for using this new project type, we're going to start with a jar file. So let's say you've got some code, it's there, it's been used for say a couple of years, it's fairly reliable. There's no reason to convert that code into C#. So we've got our jar file. We're going to go and then we'll create our binding project. Okay. We will add our jar file into that project. Then we will go in and we will generate the bindings from that. Okay. We're going to resolve any issues that we find. There's several different types of issues that we may run into. It kind of depends on how our jar file, how our class library is set up in Java. We can then go and add any kind of support classes that we need, make any kind of changes necessary. And then finally, we're going to generate our final bindings that we're going to use. And then once we've got the necessary binding library, we will then go and reference that in a project that we use. So there are some differences that I want to mention, some things that you may run into that are different between Java and .NET. One of the big syntactical differences is going to be properties. Okay, so be aware of that. In the Java world, we're typically going to have gets and sets, get type, set type, those kind of things. Whereas in .NET, C#, we're literally just going to have a property that we go assign and get values from. Another thing to remember is that we're going to have some conventional differences, such as our casing. So let's remember, in .NET, we're going to be used to what's basically termed Pascal casing. And so here's an example of Pascal casing. We've got our add numbers, and the two words add numbers, even though they are shoved together, are both capitalized. Okay, it makes it a little bit easier for us to read, at least for me. And then in Java, you're going to see things like camel casing. Okay, so here's an example of the same calling sequence, whereas we would have add, that would be lowercase, and then the numbers part would be uppercase. So just understand that's something that's different. Also, another thing that you'll run into, you can run into initializer errors, and that's just because it's one of those things that's a little bit different between C# and .NET versus Java, and that is you can't have a property or method that's going to be the same as your type. Okay, and so what you'll end up happening is this really strange error that you get inside of your .NET C# binding library, and it'll say something like, hey, your initializer that's different than what I'm expecting, and you're like, hey, what's going on here? It's just going to be something that you need to pay attention to, and I'll show you what that means when we get into some code. Now, we're going to go and we're going to switch over into Visual Studio and Eclipse and look at some code. Basically, we're going to start with some default operations so you can see what happens there. And in this, we're basically just going to start by plugging in a jar file and letting it work. And then in the binding libraries, we'll let that work. It's going to handle some capitalization for us. All right, so let's switch over and we're going to go into Visual Studio, and believe it or not, we're actually also going to jump in and show just a little bit of code in Eclipse. All right, so here we are. We've jumped over into Eclipse. This is a project that I've got set up. It's got some fairly simple methods inside of it. This is just for example purposes. So let's go in and let's start off by taking a look at basic class file that I've got. And so in here, I've got something showing my company com.scalabledevelopment.math, so we can think this is going to be a math library. And then we've got a class here, and I've defined this as just going to be some mathematical operations. All right, so notice here that I've got some integer values set up. This will make more sense as we look at code later on, not necessarily with the default configurations, what's going on. But I think here's some important pieces to look at. I've got a number of methods defined. Notice that I've got a couple of static methods. I conveniently call them static add. Notice that one set takes a series of floats, another takes a series of integers. I've kind of got the same thing going down here. I've got some multiplication methods, got some subtraction methods, and a few others. And some of them are static, some of them are not. Okay, so I just want to show that the library is capable of using both. All right, so now we're going to switch over and let's take a look at this inside of Visual Studio. So now I'm going to switch over and we're going to look at our project over here. So here is our binding library. Okay, and this is just a project that I've created. I've gone into File, I've said New, I've said Project, and here we go. We're going to create a Java binding library. Okay, but I've already done that. So by default, how does this work? So the first thing is we're going to have a jar folder, and we're going to add in a jar library. Okay, and in this case, I'm just going to go in, I'll say add existing, and then I happen to already have been in this directory. So you can see my library. I add this in. We'll go ahead and we're going to say replace. Okay. And then also I want to note we've got a build action here. This will need to be set. I would say probably 80% of the time an input jar is going to be the right one. If it needs to reference, if it's a library, it's kind of a support library, it may need to be something like a reference jar. But most of the time, an input jar is what you're going to be looking for. Okay, so then I've just added this in. Haven't really done anything else to modify it. Now I want to go ahead and I want to hit build. So I'm going to build, doing a build started, and then we've done a build succeeded. Okay, so what has this actually gone and done for us? So let's go out here, and this is on my file system, and notice that I've got a binding library, and this is just happens to be the name of my project. So you can note binding library, and then here's the name of my assembly. And I want to go in and I want to see, okay, what does this look like in the disassembler? Okay. So let's take a look and notice that I've got this operations file. And by the way, just in case you're wondering, yes, I had another file in there called echo, which we'll take a look at later on. But inside of here, you'll see that I've got a number of the methods that I would expect. Okay, so I've got my static add, static multiply, all these kind of items. Okay. And so these are going to be available to us. So now I'm going to go over to a little activity that I've created. And let's go through and we'll see that, hey, I've got, so I've already referenced this in my project. So I can go in and I've got my IntelliSense, and notice that I've got, and these are, notice that's one of those static constant values. Say we had static add. Now notice this. You actually did get this capitalization that I had mentioned. Static add. So I can go in and I can say, okay, what are my values? Note I've got value float P0, float P1. But now also notice something else here. Remember I had two methods. One was an integer and one was would take a set of floats. Okay, and let's see, get that to come back up. And here we go. Here you can see here's the integer version. Here's the float. Okay, and if I do a build, okay, great. So the key piece here, the key takeaway, and we're going to look at this a little bit more, is that I can use my code in my activity. Let me just show you some other things. And I can use it as I would expect, okay? So let's say I have something, here we've got some of our other methods that we've set up. Just a second. Got these. This is one that's defined. This is not a static method. So so that's also available to us. Call this val2. And so notice that we've got access to all that code that's inside of our library that's exposed to us. So basically anything that's public and exposed to us, we can then go use here.